sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop. Leda and the Swan is a sonnet that William Butler Yeats wrote and rewrote many times, but finally appeared in this form in his renowned collection called The Tower, published in 1928 when he was 63. The Tower was the first book of poems he released after becoming a Nobel laureate 5 years prior. Yeats is of that exceptionally rare breed of artist who improved in quality as he entered his late life. The poem takes its subject from Greek mythology, the story of Zeus assuming the form of a swan to seduce Leda, wife of the Spartan king Tyndareus, who bore from this union Helen of Troy, whose infidelity ignited the Trojan War and the beginning of classical history. Now, before we explore the way Yeats used this subject to create meaning, just take a quick look at the actual shape of the poem. There's something unsettling about it. The form of the sonnet appears to be hijacked everywhere. It's twisted and torn apart. Like Dr. Frankenstein, Yeats has surgically attached the Shakespearean sonnet with its first two quatrains featuring an A-B-A-B rhyme scheme, with the Petrarchan sonnet in the last 6 lines and an E-F-G-E-F-G rhyme scheme, including the unnerving slant rhyme up and drop, which robs the final moment of any auditory closure. Most notable of all, though, is line 11, which appears to be slashed and split in two, leaving the final 3 lines just dangling there, like Leda herself in the indifferent beak of the swan. In this way, Yeats commits a kind of violence on the sonnet form. Not for nothing, the poet is attempting to augment the violent content of his work. Sonnets, at least Shakespearean sonnets, are traditionally about great love, and yet here Yeats uses the form to describe what could be considered the exact opposite, an act of violent rape. And if you look at successive versions of Leda and the Swan, you can see that Yeats turned up the volume on this violence. For example, in one version, the poem begins, "A rush, a sudden wheel, and hovering still, the bird descends, her frail thighs pressed by the webbed toes, and that all-powerful bill has laid her helpless face upon his breast." Now, the early version almost assumes Leda's acquiescence to the god's advances. In the later version, beginning with the shock of a sudden blow, Zeus's molestation is intensely emphasized, and emphasized too is Leda and the reader's disorientation, the great wings beating still, the ambiguity of beating still. How can wings be still if they're beating? And on the other hand, if he means that they're still beating, that means terrifyingly that the rape has already begun while the swan is still in the air. Now, in this version, the girl is staggering, her thighs caressed, a word that disturbs us by commingling the erotic with the vicious, something that Yeats does a bunch in this poem. Caressed by the dark webs. That gives a sense of just how big the bird is, because not even the toes, but the webs between the toes are what's caressing her. And it should be noted that both the first and second line end with enjambments, pulling us awkwardly through the verse. And it's not until the last line of that verse that we finally get the subject he, as if everything was happening so fast that Leda couldn't find her bearings until the gruesome act was already underway. The first quatrain of Leda and the Swan is disturbing in the extreme, setting the scene from Leda's horrified point of view. Then we have the second quatrain, which is made up of 2 rhetorical questions. Both seem to ask the same thing. what could Leda do? Against the awesome power of a god, how could she possibly resist? How can she do anything but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? These questions can be read in two ways. You can read them rhetorically, which is to say, read them as saying, obviously she can't do anything, and such is the tragedy of the poem. But I think Yeats invites us to read them literally as well, which is to say, what can she do? More on that in a moment. After the first two verses comes the volta, a term for when a sonnet turns and the questions or events posed in the first lines are answered. In this case, after the shudder, referring both to the moment of ejaculation and Leda's fear, we have the poet examining the consequences of the rape, and they are really far-reaching. The broken wall, the burning roof and tower all intimate that the rape of Leda not only caused, but ensured the eventual destruction of Troy and the rise of Greece and Western history, a history that was born out of rape, war, and murder. And Agamemnon dead. Here we have Yeats's own alteration to the mythological history. As the story goes, Leda laid 2 eggs. One bore Helen and Pollux, demigods and children of Zeus, and the other bore Castor and Clytemnestra, children of Leda's mortal husband, Tyndareus, who she laid with the same night. By citing the death of Agamemnon, famously killed by his wife Clytemnestra, as among the fated ramifications of the rape, Yeats demonstrates the full effect of the trauma. And by doing this, he reaches into the history of art as well, because the calls to Troy and Agamemnon's death bring to mind, respectively, Homer's Iliad, the pinnacle of the epic form, and Aeschylus's play, the Oresteia, the first great work of Western drama. All this is done in 11 words, without even mentioning the continued sexual overtones. And then Yeats concludes the poem with one final question. Did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? And to understand this and the poem itself in its larger context, we have to know a little bit more about Yeats and his way of thinking. From his early life, Yeats had always been drawn to mysticism, to astrology, and to the occult. In middle age, he developed his own complex metaphysical and cosmic system, which he laid out in extreme detail in a book called A Vision. One of the key ideas was that history was made up into gyres, or cycles of about 2,000 years, alternating between ages of spirituality and ages of secularism. Each cycle reached the peak of its excellence in the exact middle, then decayed slowly until it was finally replaced by the new one. This idea was explored most potently in his famous poem, The Second Coming. Yeats identified his own time, our time, as the end of the religious cycle of Christianity, and envisioned the start of a new, unknown cycle of secularism initiated by the coming of a great beast. The last time such a cycle began is the subject of Leda and the Swan. The rape of Leda by Zeus signals the start of the classical era, around 2000 BC. In each case, the divine visits the earth and leaves the seeds of the history that is to come. This is the key to Yeats's question. Did she put on his knowledge with his power? Did Leda glimpse the future she was creating, the cycle she was inaugurating before the indifferent god flew away? In some way, he suggests, the shape of things to come is contained in its origin. But can humans discern it? That's the question. Now, all this stuff about gyres and cycles and mystical systems, it's pretty out there. Clearly, it isn't in any way scientific or even very specific. There's a real debate about whether Yeats believed any of it. Probably in some way he did. But what was clearly more important to him was having a unified system in the first place, because it was from the many symbols of this unity that Yeats was able to extract his strongest poetry. Having that matrix of sliding meanings to work with, so tightly and intricately woven, meant that pulling one string, evoking one symbol, laying one idea into the form and meter of a sonnet, would make the rest of the web light up like a Christmas tree, signifying a complexity that invites the reader into a number of simultaneous interpretations. By situating the poem at a fulcrum in history equal to our own, we're forced to look both at what we're coming out of and what we're heading toward, a relevant question for any age, particularly relevant for Yeats's own when the trauma of World War I must have come like a sudden blow. By posing questions of possible resistance to this brutal act, but showing no resistance on the part of Leda, even possible enjoyment, the readers themselves are called on to imagine how we resist oppression and the nature of resistance itself, both from a feminist point of view and a political one. By depicting an encounter with the divine so savagely, we're asked to examine the price of inspiration. And by posing questions without giving answers, the knowledge and the power of poetry itself is called into question. All these things are compressed into Yeats's Leda and the Swan, spring-loaded, triggered by an image or a tense or a pun or a slant rhyme. That so much could be packed into 14 lines and 113 words is a testament both to Yeats and the continuing importance of poetry. All that's left is to pull one string and see what sublime network of meanings lights up. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. I had so much fun putting this video together. I love this poem. I said in the last video that I'm doing the Nerd Writer full time now, and this is the kind of quality of content that I can make with this time and this effort. And it's all possible because you guys have been pledging to the channel on Patreon, and I want to continue to ask to donate a little bit of your money to this channel because there is so much more that I want to do, and I'm so excited for the stuff that's coming up. So as little as $1, you can click right here on the screen right now. Everything helps. Thank you again so much. If you want to check out another video, you can see my analysis of In the Mood for Love, which I did a couple weeks ago. Great movie. I want to expand this series into a lot of different art forms and mediums, comics, even maybe music, TV, lots of cool stuff. I think there's just a lot of opportunity for really awesome stuff, and then some stuff that isn't understanding art is coming up too. So thank you again, and I will see you next time.